Panworks, bringing ethics to life. Welcome to PanThinks, a production of Panworks. I'm your host, Bill Lynn. Today, we are delighted to welcome Greg McElwain to speak with us about the ethics and philosophy of Mary Midgley. Greg is a professor of philosophy and religious studies at the College of Idaho. He's the author of Mary Midgley, An Introduction. His research focuses on the intersection of animals and environmental ethics, where Mary Midgley's concept of the mixed community features prominently. And we'll be talking a lot about the mixed community today. He also collaborated with Mary Midgley during the final years of her life. The product of this collaboration is Mary Midgley on What Matters, Conversations on Science, Ethics, and Nature, a book that's out in 2026. Welcome, Greg. It's a special treat to have you here today.
Thank you, Bill. And thanks for everyone joining us today. I'm really pleased to see so many people.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Now, I just want to give you a little context for this conversation. We have, and give other people a context for this conversation. We have an internal reading group. We call it the Salon. And the Salon starts, the first reading every year is one of Mary Midgley's, because the Panworks as a shop is enamored of Mary. And we read your book. You were the first non-Mary Midgley, directly Mary Midgley book that we read, and you're the first book about Mary Midgley. Folks said they adored it. Other folks said, where has she been all our lives? You've told me that that's a common perception that you experience with people.
Oh, of course. I mean, within philosophy, it's variable because, there's differing levels of Midgley uptake over the years, but many are pretty familiar with her, but especially non-philosophers, non-specialists. I've often had a similar reaction of, I know this philosopher, maybe I don't know much philosophy at all, but Midgley is an eye-opener to me, someone that I understand, connect to, have been looking for. These are the types of things you'll hear, including colleagues who have, for instance, I had a colleague who a couple of years ago, well, I guess it was about 6 years ago now, we had an event on campus celebrating Mary Midgley, Notes from a Biscuit Tin. It's in its second rotation now. We could say more about that later if you'd like. But mainly it was an interaction, a dialogue between a philosopher and a poet inspired by Midgley's work. And our theme was holism. And we focused on the environment, but also broader holistic themes. And my colleague, Dyer, a well-known poet, never read Midgley, and after reading Midgley and a little bit of my book, and having this event where we kind of explored her thought, she was very inspired. Wrote a number of poems, sonnets based on Midgley's philosophy, and eventually published a book of poetry inspired by Midgley that's done really well. So wow. That's a good example of that kind of initial where has she been type of response, I think.
That'd be why, if you could send me the information for that, as well as the information for the Biscuit Tin, and we'll get to that. Sure. But I'll make sure it gets in the show notes. Now, this is a really broad question, and I know it might be difficult to ask, but I'm wondering how it is you became a philosopher and why it is you decided to focus on Mary Midgley.
Yeah, that is a big question. I was always interested in the academic side of things, especially I would say early on in my undergraduate career was looking to pursue a career in academia, and I was really interested in teaching. I wasn't sure where that would lead, but I knew I wanted to do something like that. I was drawn to it. I started off in more textual studies, as I like to say, but Greek and exegesis and things like this that tended to be more toward religious studies. Over time, I became less interested in that, though some of those principles might have lingered a little bit with me that I gained from that form of study, and moved more into ethics, philosophy, science, environment, animals, all these things that I'm interested in today. And a big part of that shift was Mary Midgley, appropriately enough. I, after about a year of grad school, became less interested in the textual side of things and became more interested in what I saw as more like relevant, applicable,
Mm,
forms of fields of study. Naturally, is drawn to philosophy and ethics in particular. And having read Midgley's Beast and Man for the first time was really kind of, I think, inspired. Is really the best word I could think of.
mm,
By the way she brought together all of these topics that I saw as very in, relevant, engaging, real world in a way that I hadn't quite experienced with the other fields of humanities that I had been kind of trained in. So it was an eye opener. Where has she been in
hmm
that type of moment? I had that as well. And I explored philosophy for a couple more years, but along the way realized that she was a good guide for what I wanted to do, and continued to follow that path in so many words, which eventually has led to today with the, little trails along the way. But in so many words, looking for something more interesting and relevant was the
hmm
one of the main things that drew me into philosophy. And then
Right.
Midgley herself, I would say.
Okay. Another big question. Um, and then I'll start to hone down. Mary Midgley isn't very well known in North America, although she's quite famous in Europe and other places. Um, how is it that is there a way to describe the work of Mary Midgley, who she is, how she evolved, what's distinctive about her philosophy overall?
Yeah, I mean, it took a book to do something like that already, but I'll
Hmm
try to boil that down because there's a lot of um, rich takeaways from Midgley's work, I would say. But general themes, I think, she's well known for seeing philosophy as an embedded practice in life, that it's not one of these, while it has these very scholastic elements, this kind of ivory tower element that especially she was very familiar with in her training at Oxford at the time. Um, it has these pieces, these components that are certainly worthwhile and further the discipline in relevant ways. But she's
hmm
always been drawn to practicing philosophy in a way that grounds it in life, um, in
mm
relationships, in the world around us, and our understanding of humans as animals, a major theme, and then kind of where that takes us. And for her, it would regularly take her to issues that were relevant not just in the philosophical literature, but to everyday life, because she thought how we think influences how we live, and that's then that dynamic between philosophy and morality that she saw as really pivotal to the philosophical process. So as far as what philosophy is about for her, it was very much about how to explore what it means to be human, and then more
mm.
importantly, in relation to how we live. And so I think that stands out as maybe one of the more distinctive features, especially as at the time when she was trained and coming out of this heavily this era heavily influenced by logical positivism and the movement away from being able to say anything meaningful about morality. She really wanted, along with her peers, also known as the Wartime Quartet, we could talk about them as well. She really wanted to bring philosophy, moral philosophy, back down to life as something that's truly is relevant and important to how we live. And then that just becomes applied to everything, piece by piece for her, and extending outward into this broad corpus that she eventually develops over time.
Well, yeah, do situate her in the quartet because one of the important things is she's an early feminist philosopher who's quite famous in a coterie of other famous feminist philosophers.
Yeah, so Midgley went to Oxford around World War II. That's the name of the Wartime Quartet, where she met and befriended a number of people. But the three that stand out alongside her are Elizabeth Anscombe, who is a well-known analytic philosopher, known for her collaboration with Wittgenstein and also her contribution to moral philosophy. Also, Philippa Foot as well, who also is known for major contributions to moral philosophy in the 20th century, including her thought experiment of the trolley problem, for instance. And then also Iris Murdoch, who herself was a well-known, a skilled philosopher, as Midgley has said, but also a well-known, novelist as well, known outside of philosophy. So these four kind of were at Oxford at the same time when, as the story goes, many of the men were off at war, fighting or whatever else they were involved with, and leaving behind typically conscientious objectors, those who were seen as, fit for service, things like this. So it was an interesting environment in which they saw, maybe at the time, but also kind of retrospectively as, well, at least Midgley saw as something that allowed for perhaps the flourishing of female voices, as she's put it, in ways that might not have been as possible. Maybe a potentially less combative environment, less focused on reinforcing the kind of philosophical orthodoxy of the time, scoring dueling points through argumentation, philosophy is dueling, argumentation, a less combative environment overall. And she looks back at that as kind of the sociological factors that might have, and other demographic factors that might have contributed to their ability to flourish out of that environment. And they all went in their different directions. Anscombe and Foote being most entrenched in the kind of mainstream philosophy, as people would recognize them in mainstream moral philosophy, Oxbridge type philosophy. Whereas Murdoch kind of was in and out, kind of straddling as she moved more into her career as a novelist. But Midgley herself left Oxford before she finished her dissertation, which was also influential because it started a very unorthodox philosophical career, especially given how long and productive and one might say renowned it ended up being. And so these four women, in their own way, really transformed moral philosophy in the 20th century, depending on the narrative that you follow. And there have been a number of scholarly, not just articles, but books about them lately, including Metaphysical Animals by Clare and Rachael Wiseman, and When They're Up to Something by Benjamin Lipscomb, also an American. So there's a couple of us over here doing things. And they've drawn a lot of attention to their philosophical friendship, their experiences, both kind of while at Oxford, but then later on, their distinct contributions and all of these directions. And Midgley tends to be the one that's focused on as having, she's a little bit of an oddball in the group in the sense that she's not following those same kind of more orthodox paths and publications and whatnot at certain times in their careers, but she goes on to publish more than any of them, and to have her own real influence in areas that she saw as important, right? She wasn't as focused necessarily all the time on the things that were seen as mainstream in their domains. And that in particular would be not just human nature, but thinking about animals as well is what I focused on as one of her key contributions that kind of carries through to today.
Well, let's go there then. And for fun, we could break this up into categories like people, animals, and nature. When it comes to people, she's famous for noting that we're not just like animals, we are animals. And that has real implications for the meaning of human nature. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, she saw, her first and most influential book was Beast and Man. It was published in 1978. It came out of a period in time where she was looking to as she put it, kind of reinstill, I guess you might say, the concept of human nature into philosophy as something that had been neglected, lost, especially in the loud kind of nature-nurture debate, extremism, as you might call it, right? Having kind of either or views on that, what shapes human behavior, et cetera, et cetera. So she was very influenced and spent a number of years. I kind of call this her Jedi training period, where she just kind of is out of the limelight for a little bit. She's left Oxford, um, and in the 50s, she gets a position. She gets a position at Reading University. She moves to Newcastle with her husband Jeff, also a philosopher. Um, takes a position at Newcastle. It's not until much later that she also takes a position at Newcastle after raising three children there. She's um, reviewing books. She's doing radio broadcasts. She's publicly engaging with people about philosophy. A real example of a public philosopher before it's became such a, I don't know, widely. I mean, it's much more popular now, I would say, especially in the age of social media than it was then. And so she's doing all these things, but she's not out of the loop. And one of the things that she was doing during this period before she started writing for journals more kind of aggressively or consistently, and then also took a position at Newcastle herself, was really consuming the literature, the burgeoning literature on animal studies, especially ethology. This is an area that she was heavily drawn to. But anything zoological she could get her hands on, she seemed to devour. And what came out of this was, by the time that she published her first kind of major works in the mid to late 70s, she's very far along in this kind of sophisticated understanding of humans as not just animals, but an animal among other animals that have relevant, the understanding of which is relevant to understanding our nature. And so those scientific fields of study, of animal studies, were really illustrative for her in how we might think of ourselves in more kind of comprehensive, grounded, realistic ways. And then from there to kind of piece from that base into how the implications that we have from that in relation to, for instance, morality, what is good or bad for humans, so to speak, and how we might think about our relations as social species, which, of course, as we see later on with their approach to animals, spills over as well as kind of this kind of ever sprawling foundation for a more kind of relational, communitarian understanding of how we connect together.
Let me ask you to drill down on that. This understanding, how does bringing this concept of humans not only as animals themselves, but as animals amongst other animals, complicate, challenge, differ from the standard ways that, let's say, environmental ethics talks and thinks about animals?
Yeah, I suppose it depends on who we're talking about. I mean, early on, she
Mm,
was not as engaging as much at this time when she's really promoting and developing these ideas. She's not engaging as much, I would say, with environmental ethicists because in a lot of ways, we see that field just kind of taking root as well, kind of along in this parallel path.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
she certainly has in mind mainstream philosophy, but also some social science that tends to abstract, kind of be what you called abstractionist, kind of remove us from nature, the tendency to kind of place a separation, a barrier between humans and other animals, between humans and nature, as if they're this kind of uh, I mean, depending on who she's critiquing, right? This idea of like kind of this free floating consciousness that can decide what
mm,
it would like to be and decide its own destiny apart from its natural context. And it can look, and those can be religious positions as well. So you have this on one side, and you also have on this other side these approaches leaning more towards sociobiology that tend to, of course, recognize and focus on the fact that we are animals, but to the extent that perhaps it becomes a bit reductionistic, reducing motives and things like this to one or a few, and kind of presenting things in this kind of very black or white determinist way. On one end, completely indeterminate, one hand determinate, right? We are animals and we are just like them, so to speak, right? And we have to come to terms with X, Y, or Z is kind of our nature, our primary
mhm,
motive, et cetera, right? And then the other
mhm,
side is trying to kind of reacting against this. So you have this give and take. As environmental philosophy develops, I mean, I think there's a lot of overlaps with the accounts that we see at the time, that she shares. And I don't know if she's really influenced by them or engaging them too much at this point, because again, there's so little. I know that she was familiar with Nass, for instance, Arnie Nass, and some other, eventually people like Baird Callicott, and so on and so forth. But her approach is a little, I would say, different than most of the starting points. It might drift more toward Ness than others, but it tended to take our understanding of what's framed as the environment as this kind of broader um, context for what we are as species. So we are humans. We're a type of animal. We live amongst other animals within nature. We are deeply connected to that world. We are dependent upon the world around us, our immediate relationships, but also these collectives and the environment, et cetera, up to the entire biosphere that we are part of. And so she thought in very kind of, yes, in individualist terms, in the sense that we have agency and direction in life, but also more holistic terms. So I always call it kind of a relational holism, rather than something like a more reductive holism, in which we are one of many, we are parts of a bigger whole in the midst of other wholes, right? And so this very kind of interactive, communitarian and holistic view started to develop over the years, which you can follow that thread in different of her works. And of course, other animals are part of that as well. So what she does is she doesn't strictly separate off animals and the environment as these separate things that we approach kind of in a piecemeal way. They are all part of this total field, right? And that we are embedded in, that we are related to, that we have obligations to, that have different claims on us in different ways,
Right.
rather than strictly separated. They're kind of overlapping. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's a good segue to move on to animals. Before I segue there, do we have much knowledge about her relationship with Arnie Nace? Because Arnie Nace uses her concept of mixed communities when he talks mixed communities of wolves, bears, and others in Norway. And this sort of relational holism you talk about is really similar to Arnie Nace's notion of nested relations of being. So were they, do we know whether they were in close contact or not and influenced each other?
I don't know. There are figures that you can see in her writing. One thing about Midgley that Midgley scholars tend to kind of joke about is she may or may not cite or reference them depending on what she's doing. So we're always a little bit, we're kind of doing detective work sometimes to see if there is someone she's engaging with or influenced by, and a lot of that's kind of by inference. But I think he was an influence. I think she did read him. I think that she has him in mind sometimes. She talks about things like deep ecology from time to time.
Right.
That's not always. Sometimes, though, when you're talking about deep ecology, it could be Ness early on, but it could also be that more American form that we see down the road, which goes in some different directions, right?
Earth first.
So she kind of sometimes will be referencing that. But she speaks in terms that are similar to him. So I don't know. I think there's something there. When I had the opportunity to interview her over the years, I think we may have mentioned his name in passing, but not in any type of way that. I mean, if I had a chance, I probably would have asked her more about him in particular. But not just the sense of. I mean, I used the term total field a while ago. That's a very
That's Nacian.
Yeah,
yeah, very is.
And the concept, I've always seen his kind of use of like the kind of term intrinsic relationality or intrinsic relatedness, I think is how he framed it. Like we are inherently defined by our relations to others. I think that was very squarely in the relational thinking, or very compatible with or complementary to Midgley's
Yes.
view of our intrinsic
Yes.
relatedness. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's go on to animals then. I really like this point you brought up and think, really resonates with not only your book, but also what we read out of Mary Midgley about how you can't abstract animals out of the environment and talk about them, much less people, as completely separate topics. So, how did Mary think about animals? And say, in that context, could you say something about the mixed community and the role that conceptual tool plays?
Sure. Hope we have a while. Um, so yeah, I'll work up to the mixed community, which is really one of the areas that I've focused on, kind of as the most technical area of what I've done with
Hmm.
Midgley, and
Hmm.
I continue to do that as well. So we can get into that. Um, so as I mentioned, Midgley's always been fascinated with animals and has devoured literature on animals, scientific literature on animals, has a very robust had a very robust conception of animals that was nuanced, that was wide-ranging, and scientifically informed in so many words.
Hmm.
And through this, she really resisted abstracting animals into this kind of broad camp. She resisted referring kind of more generically to animals, as often happens, but also just like um, putting them into broad conceptions of even domestic and wild animals. She thought in more continuous ways of all animal life, including humans, thinking importantly about species-specific natures, habits, uh, yeah, characteristic ways of life, et cetera, as being very important to how we not just understand them, but also ourselves, because we're all kind of in the
Hmm.
same camp in so many words. Um, and through that, over the years, she has a book that you maybe some of you are familiar with, Animals and Why They Matter, which is my favorite book of Midgley's. It's a brief book. It's written in 1983, the year after I was born. Um, and it works through in so many words, I think, a number of reasons why she might say animals matter. And at the time, there are different narratives we can trace of the development of animal ethics, and there are strands throughout history, but she's kind of engaging and coming into um, this burgeoning area of animal ethics where we think of people like Peter Singer, and then very soon after Tom Reagan and others that have kind of been promoting this animal rights view, this utilitarian or maybe duty-based or Kantian approach to ethics. And she um, does a few things. She, on one hand, she looks at the history of Western philosophy and a little bit of religion, and essentially levels a pretty characteristic critique of the history and its general dismissal of animals based on various criteria, typically rationalist criteria. In one sense, they're often absolutely dismissed as if they don't even matter, so there's no point in even making an argument. We've talked about absolute and relative dismissal before, Bill, and it's
Hmm.
a nice little typology to think of how philosophers have approached animals. So on the absolute side, they're not even in the equation. On the relative side, they tend to maybe factor in to the moral equation, but usually kind of at the end of the queue, after human needs are met or in a very marginal way. It's not
Hmm.
as though they mean nothing,
Back
but
of
they
the
don't quite,
bus.
the back of the bus, they don't quite fit in what's really being dealt with at hand, whether it be justice or rights or something along those lines. And so Midgley kind of goes through a standard critique of especially the rationalist tradition and individualist tradition, and that extends through kind of a pretty damning critique of Western philosophy, which is really pretty bad about a number of things, including animals. She does this with gender in another book, or women, and but eventually lands also on the developing approaches that she sees to animal ethics. So she's kind of doing a few things. She's critiquing the history of Western philosophy, also contemporary ethicists who aren't really paying much attention to animals. And then also these kind of early approaches to animal ethics. And what she is doing is saying there's something there. There's something worth exploring that these early animal ethicists are doing. And that's positive. They're especially people like Peter Singer are making a difference. Drawing attention to suffering. There are important motives that are driving things there. There's something in the intrinsic value approach, recognizing that the worth that individual animals have. And so she's partially critiquing, but also kind of supporting a lot of what's happening early in the animal ethics movement. But what she does is she contributes this, what's become more, I don't want to say popular, but more commonplace in approaches to animals over time, which is this more social relational approach to animals that takes their subjectivity, let's say subjectivity and agency, whatever we would like to call that, consciousness, sentience, but let's just say subjectivity seriously, but also puts that in relation to us and how animals matter, right? So to us, and there are many ways that they matter. So go down the list, and one of those, and this is, I think, her key contribution, is the way that they are part of our communities. And the term she uses for this is mixed community. It's a brief term. She only mentions it a couple times. When I had the chance to interview Midgley over the years, we kind of joked about how I've used the term mixed community far more than she ever had, or anyone has, because it's an area that I think is really interesting. But that's what she tends to do, and we can talk about this later. She tends to develop and promote and present some conceptual tools that we might be able to use in different ways, and she sees those as being things we can use as necessary and appropriate, but not necessarily things that need to be overdeveloped and driven into the ground. And this concept of the mixed community is a way, I think there's a few ways we can look at it, but one of them is as this kind of general description of our relations with other animals, our relation to other animals. So in the broad sense, it's kind of a placeholder, I think, right? It's kind of large scale for kind of a lot of Midgley's thinking on animals, on humans, on nature. It kind of captures all of it, that we are an animal, an embedded animal in this natural world that, much like other animals, is dependent upon it, but also each other. We have these various relationships, evolutionary, but also so this evolutionary history of our life as this broader community. And so there's a way in which it's a very abstract picture, I think, of our place on Earth, maybe our role on Earth, but also our connection to other species. And then I think in a more standard way that it's used, in the way that it probably is more of a practical tool, is a way of understanding the various historical, the spatial, temporal relations that we have had with animals in various communities throughout our history, including today. The very important roles that animals play in our social worlds, our relations to them, maybe even their relations to each other, but our community with them. And there's a lot of nuances there that we could go into, so I probably shouldn't go too far until asked. But that can include a whole range of animals. And so now in the equation, in this kind of more pluralistic kind of developing field of animal ethics here, in the equation now is thinking in more communitarian terms about animals, in more relational terms, and sense of our bonds and relations and connections and community with animals as being important. Those communities themselves matter, and the animals within them matter, as do all community members, right? And so we have this other really important facet of thinking more comprehensively about why animals matter, I think, through that in that work.
There's some critiques of the mixed community that it only applies to domesticated animals. And in that sense is maybe too, overly focused on human relationships to those animals. What do you think of such critiques?
I have so
So, for
Early
instance,
on.
you've been in conversation with J. Baird Callicott, who has one of these views that the mixed community only applies to domesticated animals, and therefore it doesn't apply to wildlife. And we don't have to consider wildlife as individuals, as members of their own or our social and ecological community. Some, like myself, have seen that as a rationalization of putting wild animals at the back of the bus. How is it that that's to give you a concrete? How is it that you think about that? Whether you agree with me or not, how do you think about that?
So this is one of those like more nuanced areas that I've written quite a bit about. And it starts to get a little more, I tend to say it's one of my more technical focuses, but it's not incredibly technical. It's just a specific area that does come up in the environmental ethics literature, which is that kind of classic separation, often a hyper separation between domestic and wild animals, and then what to do about it. Prioritize one or the other. Is it more about the holistic picture? Is it more about the individual picture, domestic, wild? And the thing that I've been writing about that my dissertation was on, in part, back in 2011, but that I've continued to work on over the years is I think a misinterpretation of the mixed community concept as being just that, as only applying to animals in a domestic context. I don't think Midgley ever meant it that way. I had the opportunity to interview her about this specifically for a couple of years, and that my suspicions were reinforced through those interviews that began with my dissertation, which is essentially that she sees, like everyone, important, relevant distinctions between all types of animals, whether they be domestic or otherwise. But the big categories of domestic and wild aren't incredibly helpful tools or ways of, let's just put that, ways of discriminating. Discrimination is very important. It maintains the integrity of animals. We don't want to just lump and group animals together just like we don't with humans, because of the real distinctions and needs that they have. Animals for her tend to be on this more fluid spectrum between domestic and wild to start with. So it's already a complicated classification system based on a number of things: roles, relations, nature, human involved, all these things. But also, wherever animals tend to fall on that very kind of murky spectrum, she never really seems to distinguish, at least not in aggressive terms, the connection and relations and community that we have with animals all along that spectrum, if we want to put it in those terms. And so she focuses a lot on, domestic animals when she talks about animals, but also the mixed community concept. She talks about everything from dogs to cats, all the usual stuff, sheep, things like this. But she also talks about wolves. She talks about certain birds. She talks about elephants and dolphins and chimpanzees. And she does not draw sharp lines between the different types of animals as being parts of our communities in some form or fashion. That's why I see her broader notion of the mixed community as being pretty all-encompassing, and then boiling down to the different communities as they play out in particular contexts, which can include a whole range of animals, because we have always been connected to various types of animals. This doesn't mean that we are, interacting with them and training them and teaching them tricks and having them in our homes, though that certainly happens. But we are living in a world in which they are integral community members that are connected to us. And so to sharply distinguish certain animals as in or out of that community for her is a bit misguided, maybe a little bit rash, especially if we're concerned about the many types of claims, overlapping claims that different beings might have on us. Those include more domestic animals, more wild animals, but it also includes the wild itself, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
nature itself, a collection of entities. These don't have to be so rigidly separated out. Um, Description and awareness and discrimination is important, but there are a whole range of claims that can coalesce for different types of beings. And so she doesn't see a need often complementary claims to be separated out so rigidly. Yeah.
Oh, that okay. I want to get to your next book, but one more question before I get to the next
Oh,
book. We've
sure.
gone through people, animals. I just want to talk about a little bit about nature. Towards the end of her life, she was writing a lot about Gaia and sort of conceptualizing this larger nested self-realization, to put it in the words of Arnie Nace. What could you say about Gaia and how she was thinking about nature overall?
That's an interesting question that I'm still thinking about. I've
Mm,
been thinking about it as I've written this new book because I had the chance to interview her, as I've mentioned a couple times now. I probably should stop saying that. And
you spent
over the
8 years of interviews with her,
yes,
right? Right.
yes, 8 years, 2011 to 2018. And one of the things that I asked her about from time to time was Gaia, just because it was something that she developed an increasing interest in over the years,
Hmm.
going into, say, the 2000s. And then after 2009, maybe, didn't say much about it after that. Her final
Mm,
10 years of writing, I believe. And so I was curious as to what she thought of it now, so to speak, when I was interviewing her, and what drew her to it. And she was always drawn to um, not, I mean, I think there is some work now that I'm aware of that's being done on Midgley and Gaia specifically, graduate work on this.
mm,
So I think we might see some more interesting stuff on this
mm,
topic. Um, I see Midgley as very resistant to. She talks of myths very often as these ways of picturing the world that
hmm.
reflect the world, but also kind of shape the way we see the world. And they tend to have different emphases. They're not true or false myths. They're just kind of ways that we imagine the world. And there are numbers of them. One of those being kind of a more mechanistic myth, like the Cartesian idea of nature as objective and mechanical. Also atomistic myths, like things being separate and apart and distinct. You get a lot of that with like Hobbes, for instance, that atomistic egoism. And so she was very against those types of ways of envisioning the world. And she
Mm,
saw myths as very important and something you can't get rid of. And so one important thing is to criticize the myths, to rebalance them, to rethink them, and then also to draw in other ways of seeing the world that kind of can round out or maybe even like challenge or complement, however it turns out, the other myths. And so naturally, being opposed to this more mechanistic and kind of atomistic way of seeing the world, she was drawn to positions that were more holistic, um,
hmm.
and that were more integrative,
Hmm.
interconnected, relational. And so, of course, something like, I mean, there are a lot of ways that a lot of approaches that do that, but Gaia is just kind of like all those things, right? The idea of this
Hmm.
interconnected whole that operates as one. All the parts have a role, are important to the other parts. It just makes sense. And so I think she was, as she criticized these positions over the years, I think she saw Gaia as like a pretty like ready-made, and I've used that term before, but like kind of counter, right, to
Hmm.
those ways of seeing the world. And so the extent to which she fully took on the notion of Gaia, that it is, a living organism itself, I think
Hmm.
is a question to think about. I think when we talked about in the interview, she called it two different things. She called it a myth and a metaphor at different times, for understanding our relation, almost a parental
Hmm.
relation with nature. That it's not something we were given to work with, but it's something that we owe everything to. And so this idea that it's a more it's a more balancing, representative way of our that we connect to nature and what we owe to it. Um,
So just
and
to
again,
clarify, when you say parental relationship, you're not talking paternalism from humans for nature. You're talking about our our embodiment within and the sustenance that nature provides us.
yeah, right. As if, I mean, as in you, um, you owe something to it, so to speak, right?
Better
Um,
said. Better said.
yeah.
Thank you.
hmm
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for that. And so, in that way, there are embedded in that are important reasons for action, right?
Mm,
Behavior and certain types of
right.
behavior. Whereas the more mechanistic and atomistic view you might have to do some real legwork to move to a point where one sees a reason to act in the benefit of nature,
Right.
something like that.
Right.
So, as an ethicist, primarily a moral philosopher whose first and foremost goal is a certain form of action, philosophy is practical, and how we understand ourselves in the world we live in as something that shapes how we act, right? I mean, it makes a lot of
Mm,
sense that Gaia fits in there for her. But she did
mm,
move away from it. I don't know if move away from it is the best word, but she just didn't phrase it. She didn't talk about it as much later on. So I know it was
mm,
something she called a myth. She called it a metaphor. She saw it as useful. I think she saw it as having scientific value and was not convinced by scientists that were critical of it and more dismissive of Gaia. So, jury's out there. I know some work is being done on this now, so maybe we'll see more as that comes along on Midgley's views on Gaia. But we did get a chance to talk about it a bit. But I do think it comes down to, again, finding ways to think more holistically, less atomistically,
mm.
mechanistically, thinking more in terms of vital life, and then how and why we might have reasons to respond to that. Yeah.
Okay. That's really helpful. Well, let's wrap up the interview by going to this forthcoming book. Tell us about it.
Oh, right. So that's on my mind as I'm working on my final revisions that are due
Hmm.
soon enough. And
Yeah.
so there's a lot going on up here about that right now. But basically, this book is, as I've gestured to a couple times, the result of these years of interviews that I had with Midgley as I had a chance to collaborate with her, starting with my dissertation in 2011, carrying through till a couple months before her death in 2018. So 8 years of regular in-person interviews at her home in Newcastle for a day or two at a time. Um, she was very generous and welcoming for just a random graduate student from the United States at the time in 2011.
She always was.
And she's always generous, and I know you have some very good stories about that generosity
Hmm.
as well. And
Mm.
it's always she's always very supportive of students, a very nurturing person. She can be very um, scary and critical if you're on the wrong side of her iron.
Hell yeah.
But she can also be she's very nurturing and
Yeah.
loves to just talk with people about
Yeah.
philosophy, life.
Yeah.
And that's what I got a chance to do for all those years. And so
Mm.
early on, the focus was really on the mixed community and some of my claims that I was making in my dissertation, which I got to kind of essentially test with her, which is kind of rare for philosophy, I would say. And then it continued in that vein as I got a chance to go back the next year and the next year for funding, and then it broadened out. And by the third year or so, I realized something kind of unique is happening here, where she's welcoming me back, she for whatever reason, and that we are exploring these topics. And so I would started introducing more topics that gradually started to form into roughly the chapters that I have, for the first book that I did.
Hmm.
Uh, and that was, in a way, a real background to the book that helped me kind of constantly,
Mm.
once I once this book was under contract, was able to kind of calibrate what I was saying, bounce things off her. I had the opportunity over 2 years of writing the book to kind of be like, um, here are the categories I'm talking about. I'd like to just work through this, this, and this with you to make sure I'm understanding this properly. Or, here's an issue I anticipate. What do you think about this? Um, and so anyway, all of that was I was developing those interviews over the years, and that was ironically, actually, the first book that I proposed to write was that interview book.
Oh, interesting.
So
Interesting.
it was a book that was going to be a conversational introduction to her philosophy. And the
Hmm.
publisher came back and was like, "Well, maybe just do an introduction, and we'll see about the other thing." So we did the introduction, and that was published in 2020. And so then after she had passed, I had a lot of interest because there are some snippets from the interviews in the book. I had some interest in the book, so I went back to the
Hmm.
publisher, and this time they were like, "Yes, let's do that." And so it's a similar thing. It's a
Mm.
conversational. It's a thematically curated presentation of the interviews over the years. I have an intro that kind of sets things up, and then each chapter kind of presents a handful of selections from the interviews on the given topics, be it human nature, morality, animals and the environment, religion and science, things like
Right.
that.
Right. Right.
And so, yeah, it's been interesting pulling it all together and framing it into a coherent volume because it's over 8 years. It's the only book that I know of that's like that. So I didn't have much to work with and just kind of had to like improvise and invent some ways of doing
Mm.
it. But I think it's come together pretty nicely just because of some of the things that we talked about and the way that
Hmm.
she addresses things. And that kind of, I just kind of followed her lead and then just kind of built the structure and the narration and the theming around it.
Right.
And it's really enjoyable. And hopefully people will see her liveliness and her style and her concerns and all these things in it one more time, so to speak, when it comes
Yeah.
out. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I just want to say I'm deeply grateful for the systematic introduction you've done to date. I'm envious of the amount of time you got to spend with her.
Yeah.
But that envy is not green envy. It's just like it's like a happy envy, a happiness for you, a happiness for us, because this is your book, and I assume this coming book is the most sterling representation of Midgley that I think we have available to us. And I think we all benefit from that. Adam, would you be so kind as to turn on the chat for us, please? And now would be a good time for us to start taking questions. I know that in the PanWorks discussion that we had through our salon, questions of praxis, how we take theory, marriage theory, and put it into practice was really important. And maybe some folks have some questions that could start us out on that. Joanne Lindenmeyer has raised her hand. Go ahead, Joanne.
Well, first of all, thank you. And I have to say, I'm not like most of you. I'm not an ethicist and I'm not a philosopher, but I do hang with people like Bill Lynn. So I feel like I certainly have a great interest. My career has been in public health and in veterinary medicine, and most recently in something Bill is anticipating. That's something called One Health. And I'm hoping that Bill and maybe Liv and Fred can kind of jump in here. My first question to you, Greg, is have you encountered One Health?
Uh, n- Not that I know of, but
Okay.
perhaps.
So, I mean, after listening to everything that you had to say, I am seeing a huge hole. One Health conceptually is the interrelationship, the interdependence of human, other animal, the health of humans, other animals, and nature. Um, But I will say, and it's a concept, and it's kind of taken over the world. All the major public health and veterinary medical and human health, well, less so human health institutions, because there's a lot of money. And it kind of began in the 90s with, the sort of resurgence of these emerging infectious diseases and things that threatened human health. So it's very much in service of human health and far less so in the service of nature and other animals. But what I'm seeing is that there is, and now there's something called One Health Ethics, which I'm kind of dipping my toe into, which has kind of become an amalgamation of research ethics, clinical ethics, maybe, maybe environmental ethics. People are struggling with this, and it takes kind of two forms. One is very contextual. What do we do? What about, is it ethical to cull dogs when there's been a case of rabies in a community? And in that sense, there are people who argue, and one person I'm working with who would argue there's a pluralism here that we need to acknowledge, and that's the only way we can really think about One Health ethics. Then there's the other group that kind of says no, there are some sort of overarching ethics that we need to apply and then perhaps tailor to individual situations. But I guess what I'm seeing is that there is not the kind of foundational ethics that you are talking about, and that Mary Midgley, I just got your book today. That foundation is not there. It's all about health, well-being, I define it fairly broadly. And it's all in the interest, it's all sort of in the interest of human health, I will say. So I am missing the discussion we're having today. There's a big gap between what I'm hearing from you and this huge international global emphasis on One Health, which was most recently adopted by, believe it or not, the Pope. So I'm really, so Bill, you know where I'm going. I get very excited about this kind of stuff, but I'm really interested to say, that foundation is not there. It's really all in the interest of health and mostly human health. So I'm interested in comments. You have really opened my eyes. I'm ready to throw out an editorial that I just wrote that's still going through revisions. Anyway, my mind is blown, and so I'd really like to hear some other comments.
Joanne, if I can paraphrase, you're asking how might we apply Mary Midgley's insights to One Health?
Yeah, that's a good succinct way to put it.
What do you think, Greg?
Well, I mean, it sounds like I need to do a little, background on this because it is very interesting sounding. I mean, but I think I get maybe I'm wrong on this, but I think the picture is that there's kind of this not anthropocentric, but a human-focused approach here that is putting the cart before the horse, so to speak, without kind of this foundation of how everything connects together and this overall well-being, right? This is the issue, and for whatever motives there may be there, the idea that why this, why now, what are the opportunities that can come to that? And yeah, for someone like Midgley, it's inherently connected, right? And so everything does connect together. And she's very interesting because she will talk about the importance of, say, enlightened self-interest by virtue of the fact that tends to be how we operate a lot of times, especially human-focused, but also. So there may be something important and valuable there in that humanistic emphasis at an individual or collective level, but that's not the whole picture, and it's not enough, because to ever have a truly kind of effective and sensitive and more comprehensive approach to any number of things, it has to be in the total picture, right? And it can't be such a piecemeal way of doing things. It has to have a grounding, I think, is nice, right? Not in one of these like, here's how you should act and why, and these kind of moral principles ways, but this picture, this understanding of the whole in which humans fit. So her view of human nature, this anthropology of human nature approach she's constantly drawing us back from that big picture down, to the small topics, and then back up to the big picture and the small topics to see where things fit and that aren't separated off and isolated as separate topics to be engaged by separate specialists, but something that is more integrated for all of us, really. And that's why she would often lament specialism and disciplinary specialization, and things like that as well, that it kind of takes that total picture away from everyone and divides things up. Yeah. Mm.
And that is a criticism of, let's say, before One Health, which is these, siloed human health, other animal health, the health of nature. and the idea is that it kind of brings them all together, but they're just not the ethical, philosophical foundation there. And to some extent, I think it's been born out of necessity because all of a sudden we've got emerging infectious diseases and zoonotic disease. Sadly, it's mostly focused on that and not much else. But because people became afraid of getting Nipah virus and all of the others that are kind of circling the globe right now. So okay, well, anyway, I just had to put it out there, and this is kind of turned over a lot of my thinking about One Health and made me see how much it lacks, if you will. Okay, so I'll turn it over.
Thank you very much, and also thanks for drawing my attention to something I need to look into a bit more for sure.
Adam.
Yeah, great question, Joanne. And I'll be definitely looking for those comments on One Health and bringing animals more fully into that framework, because I find your points and criticisms of it, of how I feel about it, actually, I've not gotten into it as much. So, Greg, I just wanted to first thank you for the book, because it has helped me understand Midgley so much better than I was before. We'd read 3 books of Midgley before this one, and I'd always enjoyed them, but I find Midgley's writing sometimes difficult for me to really pull all of the great stuff in there out of. And I through your book, I feel like I now understand her approach to philosophy and thinking a lot better, in that, this idea of presenting conceptual tools, and that she's not giving us the answers, she's challenging us to think, and provides these conceptual tools to think about problems and issues. And I came away from your book just thinking how sensible and reasonable a lot of what she talks about and critiques is. It just seems like a lot of common sense to me, in that rather than having these big philosophies that give you the answer to something, rights or utilitarianism, or even values, virtue ethics, I feel like it's much more a realistic understanding and practice of philosophy, where all of these things obviously have some sort of impact on how we think about the world and make moral choice. The pluralism, and I felt like her idea of philosophy for life really came through in your work. So thank you very much for that. And beyond just understanding the approach and appreciating that approach, I better understood some key concepts, like the mixed community and other ideas within, which I really appreciate. So I want to now ask a question, and you bear with me. There's a few threads I'll try to pull together here. But you mentioned sort of there was a quick mention of like popular philosophy when you were talking earlier, and there's this world of popular philosophy at the moment where the Stoics come out with a book this year, and that's all the rage, and there's a different book on utilitarianism, that's all the rage for a couple of years, and there's like these this hunger for thinking about how we can live better lives. But I've not seen sort of work like Midgley's, which doesn't give the answers, but sort of gives the tools and pushes back on reductive and simple answers to the world, but asks us to sit within context and complexity, and recognise that there's various ways to live and within context. And I just wonder whether there is. Do you see that Midgley's approach in not just giving straight answers, or I think there's a at the very end of the book you make this comment that she was still concerned with ways of seeing the world that divide complementary aspects of the whole into warring alternatives, and then asking us not to do that, right? And it seems like now more than ever, we need a world where we're not divided into two extremes, but we can sit and discuss together and find a reasonable or a good way to live together. Do you see that there's ways of sharing Midgley's philosophy to a broad audience that's really accessible, similar to popular philosophy books, or is that too reductive of the work? And I'm thinking in context. Had a chat with some teachers yesterday, some primary school teachers, and we're thinking about how do we help students think about the perspectives and subjectivity of animals and build empathy with animals through direct relationship and connection. And to me, Midgley's philosophy is like the stuff that I'd like them to engage with. How do we get primary school kids to engage with Midgley's philosophy? I know that's a lot. I've asked a lot of stuff out there, but just how do we take Midgley and get it out there into the world? Because it seems so reasonable and useful.
Oh, well, first of all, thank you. Thank you everyone for your questions. These are great. And the compliments, I'll take those. I appreciate it. It's really interesting because, I mean, I think in one way to think about this question is more so like, what did Mary do, right? And what she did was, even when she wasn't maybe especially when she wasn't she didn't have an academic position in Newcastle, she was still doing philosophy, right? She sees philosophy as this thing we're always doing, and that is always relevant. We can do it in better and worse ways. And she had her own kind of views on how to do that. And she would do that through radio broadcasts. She would do that through editorials. She would do that in some of her book reviews. And so she had this interesting way of kind of getting her views out there in the kind of, I think, exactly the ways you're mentioning, right? These sensible ways that counter to popular perception, as it may often be for those of us who are philosophers, is like relevant and kind of stimulating and makes sense because there's again this ivory tower, but also this more maybe even abstractionist notion of head in the clouds and all the Socrates and head in the clouds type stuff. But I mean, she's recognized that, but also that it is very down to earth, and that's why she, I think, went about it the way she did by trying to be public with philosophy. I think that's one way. Easier said than done, when you actually get out there and try to do public philosophy on social media and have the comment section, right? Or go to a public venue to speak to a public audience. I mean, that's hard work. It's not always, it's very uncomfortable work a lot of times too, and not incredibly fun. But she did it. And also choosing the topics that she did, right? By putting those out there as things these are things you're dealing with, we're dealing with, and philosophy has tools to help us think through them, right? We can kind of be like plumbers and work underneath the surface of our thought to kind of clear up the problems that are making life difficult. That's an enduring message, I think, that philosophy provides us tools to do that. And that philosophers, as philosophy departments are being closed across my country, that philosophers and philosophy departments are pretty important, in spite of what the bottom lines of different, institutions might think. And then also, I would say, by the work that she inspires. So, I try to do my part to, like, for instance, the introduction is not necessarily like a mass market book, but I'm glad to hear what you have to say about seeing how it all fits together and what her whole project, because she was a very voluminous writer and it's hard to read 250 plus things. But it's a starting point to see how it all fits together and then branch out from there, hopefully back into her work to see her kind of dealing with these things specifically, because she saw it all as connected. And I've wanted to get something, and she was kind of in my mind, but also in actual conversation, she was saying that, the book should be accessible. People should be able to read it. It should not be flooded with footnotes. They're endnotes for a reason. Mary's part of that reason, for better or worse, rather than footnotes that are distracting away from the text. And so but other people have taken her work in different ways. And I wrote a piece last year about the necessity of philosophy based on Midgley's approach, and for the blog of the American Philosophical Association. Others have written kind of about her public philosophy, and this Notes from a Biscuit Tin is an international kind of cycle of events that celebrate Midgley's life and philosophy. It happened in 2020. Bad timing. It's shifted to virtual, but it's happening again this year, where essentially a team in a different area around the world, let it be whatever, Brazil or the United States or Germany, will take a component of Midgley's work this year in relation to wild animals and mixed communities, and how we might think of the mixed community and that certain way of interpreting it as including wild animals as being some a terrain for hope rather than despair, especially when we do have a lot of reasons to despair. And so we have teams in different parts of the world, like Brazil, looking at the way that dolphins interact with local communities to fish and things like this together, and all these interesting things that highlight these kind of unique communities that exist. That's just maybe one example, but the work that she inspires, I think, can do that. And so I think a large part of what I've been trying to do over the years is draw attention to the things you're mentioning, and encourage others as they're doing that. Expand the Midgley influence, the Midgley circle, as it's been growing over the years since I first started doing this, and see where it goes. But I do think there's a lot that people can take from that offering that she had. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, thank you. And
Thank you.
your answer actually gets me thinking. There's a few places in my current teaching and undergrad I could sort of bring in philosophical plumbing, that concept, for instance, when thinking about worldviews, values, and perceptions, and how we think about how we think. So yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Well, and I missed that part of it in my response, but thinking about what some have done in the UK, some have taken her adapted lessons based on her concepts, mixed community, I think Gaia and things like this, and created pamphlets for teaching children these. And I've toyed with the idea of a children's book. I don't know why. It just seems like that would be a good terrain for eventually, right?
Yeah,
so
that would be great. And Bilbo, before you jump in, Liv has actually got a question as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Greg. This was wonderful. And just to echo everybody, the book was wonderful too. We really enjoyed reading that. Feel free to deflect or not answer, but this is more of a personal question. I'm just curious how Midgley's writing, her work, her philosophy, and even her as a person influenced, affected your relationship or attitude, perspective about animals.
I think quite a bit, actually, because it was a unique. I've had a unique path in philosophy, as I mentioned, because it really started with her in a lot of ways. And then I branched out, but then kind of came back to her and regularly was on the path inspired by her, and then was able to meet her, interact with her, interview her, all these things. And as we especially formed that more personal relationship, there was a way in which, through conversation, her ideas and the connection with her became more and more real, I guess, if that's the right term. And as you can convince yourself into a few. You can in philosophy, you can be convinced by a lot of things, and you can write yourself into a corner and defending positions that are bizarre and things like this. But the more I've written about and thought about, especially the mixed community, the more it's made sense as a way that a lot of people resonate with, myself included. It captures parts of our connection to the world that thinking in more abstract ethical terms just might not. And it doesn't mean that's comprehensive. It doesn't mean it's the whole picture, but it means it taps into something that's just that we intuitively know, I think, right? And like Adam said, a lot of Midgley's philosophy is kind of pointing us to what we do know or should know or used to know. We just need to kind of think about it for a minute and not get distracted by this or this idea or focus on this. But like because where we focus kind of distracts sometimes from what is important. And I think it's been constantly reinforced, this sense of community with not just each other, but with other species. And also, quite honestly, in a practical way, something I have to remind myself of every time my dog makes me want to go crazy with her antics. And I'd be like, she's part of the community, she's part of the family, it's okay, dogs do this, just let it go, take a deep breath. So maybe in a weird, pragmatic, therapeutic way, a way of handling our communities when they are sometimes challenging, because again, communities is a broad concept, and it can mean a lot of things. And that doesn't mean perfect. It doesn't mean good treatment. It doesn't mean harmony. It doesn't mean a lot of things. So it's actually a realistically challenging concept too, thinking in terms of community, because all communities have issues in addition to the positive, but all communities are important. So the question then is, what do you do with that, and how do you go from there? More is needed than just community. More is needed than just relations. There's a lot of work to be done there. So I think she's just helpful in pointing us toward ways that we need to move, and it's helped me in that way as well. Though I don't know if that's as personal as maybe you were pointing toward.
You may answer it as you want. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Bilbo?
Greg, thank you. This is a treat for us. As we mentioned earlier, having read now, and discussed 3 of Mary's works, and then spending time with your introduction, it's a real treat to be able to engage with you, particularly as your ideas have progressed since then. And I also want to say, and this is somewhat relevant to my question to you, thank you for mentioning the challenges of being in community with animals, and the animals with which we share our lives. And the reason why it's related to my question, which is twofold. It's about voice. And I would challenge you first with both your own writing, but also your understanding of Mary's writing. Where is the voice of the animal? Many of the books that we read, the writers deliberately position, sometimes in awkward manners, but sometimes in delightful narrative manners, the voice and the being of animals in their writing. And so I'd be interested in your own and your perception of Mary's. And then your own voice. So part of what's delightful today is that you have engaged with us in drawing in these notions of mixed community and Gaia conceptualization, which, if I understand correctly, is how your thinking has been progressing, say, over the last 10 years, and where you're hoping the conversation will continue. So where's your voice in your work, and how did you pay respect to Midgley's wish for people to do their own thinking, to do their own heavy lifting of philosophy, and maybe less of your voice, less of Mary's voice, and more of the people who are engaging with Mary's ideas?
So on the first one, I think I would need a little time to kind of process and kind of scroll through the voice for animals and Midgley's work and my work. I think that's a really interesting and challenging question. I think of examples that Midgley uses in some of her works, and when she's often trying to reorient the way we see animals from often a folk figure. She does this in Beast and Man a lot, but also in Animals and Why They Matter, right? To kind of blast through, so to speak, the philosopher's notion of an animal, or popular pop culture or literary presentations or symbolic presentations of animals to animals themselves. I think about a story that I from the interviews where we were talking about animal consciousness, and she was talking about how there's often these very highbrow notions of consciousness that will almost always, they're still around, and they kind of define by default animals out of even having the possibility of consciousness, which we know is absurd.
Yeah.
And then also by, drawing on studies about, say, like self-awareness and things like this. And this was one of the most vivid moments of the interviews, because she got she kind of got a little worked up about it. And she was talking about the stories of the paint on the nose, right, with different species, and that they can recognize themselves in a mirror. And she was like, well, why would a dog look in the mirror to see itself, right, and recognize the nose? If a dog wanted to know something, it would smell it. And she went on this kind of mini little tirade, but it was kind of in laughter too. And what she ultimately did was she went and she found a copy. She's started off the cuff, extemporaneously citing poetry. She brought up a Chesterton poem on the Song of Quoodle, which is about this dog who laments for humans their inability to smell and engage with the world, and all the world that they're missing because they can't smell. And so she basically recited the entire poem. Then she went and found the poem and had me read it out loud in the middle of this interview, which I had never done. And it was a fun moment. She laughed, and we had a good time with that. But I think I don't know if there's as much of that exploratory perspective that we see more often now of, someone like Mara does, Coach Cara, right? The thinking in poetry, and thinking more empathetically from the terms of the animal, how they see and experience and engage the world, and maybe speak, so to speak. There are many people doing that, and I don't know if that was Midgley's area per se, but I think her intent is similar, right? By drawing attention to actual animals themselves rather than these kind of symbolic or fictional things that we've created. I would maybe gesture toward that a bit, and in my work too. Likewise, I've not engaged in that way, but Mara keeps roping me into doing these animal assisted philosophy and multi-species poetry and things like that. So she's pushed me personally to do things like that quite a bit, which has been good for me. But I always joke with her that it's like, this is way out of my comfort zone. So, I mean, I think that's the best to have at the moment for where's the voice of the animals, is kind of pointing toward it. But I think that is a really important and challenging question. And then I think the other question was, if I heard correctly, was getting at where the dynamic of Midgley's perspective and voice, how my perspective and voice fits into that as an interpreter, interlocutor, and then where the reader and others taking that, where they fit into this equation as well, which I think is always something is on my mind. When I was asked by the publisher could you actually just do a comprehensive introduction to Midgley's philosophy? Would that be okay? And, I was like, okay. But that was a huge task. Not just because of the corpus of her work, but also because I was visiting her yearly. She is essentially witnessing this happen, so to speak. And I wanted to get it right. And the interviews were a good way to do that. And as mentioned early on, there's a part of me that is still there from my early textual days where I want to be faithful to the text. I want to get things right. I don't want to extrapolate and go too far beyond that. So I think that between Midgley on this shoulder and my textual days right here, and then the weight of making sure to get it right, I really tried to focus on her voice and the spirit of her work. And she read it. She read each chapter. She gave me her final thoughts and was writing a foreword for it when she passed, actually. In that, I was, I think, very cautious. I was a very cautious writer at the time. It was my first book. I didn't want to go too far astray. I think though, especially as we get in areas that are more of my specialty, the animals and the environment part, you see a lot more of my voice, and you might recognize that in other of my stuff my work if you read it, because that's more clearly in my wheelhouse. Because when you write about Midgley, you're writing about a million things. You're writing about philosophy of mind and metaphysics and ethics and animals and the environment and philosophy of science and philosophy of religion. And you can't be an expert on every area, however much she seemed to be that at times. And so I think it was a matter of extent of confidence and familiarity in these different areas, where you'll see more of my interpretation and my contextualization of it. And that's special, that comes out more maybe toward the philosophy of religion, the animals, the environment, philosophy of science, and things like that. Anyway, so by doing that, I'm hoping to bring it into a context that makes it hopefully digestible in one place that people can take something from. And then still, though, ideally not over define, over conceptualize, the philosopher's tendency is to clarify concepts and just until they're no more. I mean, just to really beat them to death and in these airtight ways. And that makes a lot of sense, because this conceptual analysis is a big part of what philosophy is about. But I think Midgley kind of resists that. I think she gives us things that she sees as useful, tools. I mean, it depends on the topic, but tools as needed, and maybe other tools are needed at other times, other concepts are needed other times. And she talks a lot about, I use terms as they're needed. And if one term doesn't work, then another one may be more appropriate. And that's pushes back against a lot of philosophers being like, here's the term, I'm going to hyper specify and define it, and then exclude and all this stuff at the same time. And she kind of resists that. And so I think that inherently there's going to be that, here it is from Midgley, even through someone like me, that there's still stuff to do with it. There's a lot of directions you can go with that tool. And that's what I hope people will be able to do after encountering her work in particular, but maybe mine as well. Yeah.
Super. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
That's a good place to pick up. Is Fred still with us? Because he had a really important point he made. Maybe I could make it for him. And if Fred, you're listening, and
Fred's here.
Is Fred here?
Fred just turned on their camera.
Okay, Fred.
You need to turn
had
on
a really
your audio,
important.
Fred.
Yeah, turn on your audio, Fred.
Well, if you don't mind, Mr. Moderator, I'd like to ask a different question first.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
Okay. So, Greg, first of all, ditto on all thank you so much for your book and your work. When Midgley was putting together the mixed community concept, she certainly kind of relied on countering human exceptionalism, but also she seemed to really admire some of the work of ethologists on social behavior. And, she gave the examples, everybody knows great apes and elephants and the like. And so if you sort of take this direction of mixed community and you're doing the hard philosophical plumbing, it seems somewhat that she was pointing you towards more compassionate action towards individual animals. And so my question is, how did she speak towards the mixed community helping guide appropriate ethical actions toward animal collectives, populations, species, and ultimately ecosystems? Is the mixed community, I mean, I guess at the end of the day, the ultimate mixed community is an ecosystem. And so how did her thinking help guide us in how we choose ethical behavior towards higher categories, which is especially problematic right now in the wildlife conservation community? How do we treat individual animals versus collectives when, both are very important?
Yeah, thank you. And that is a key aspect of what I focused on with Midgley's work, because I think, yes, she did do most of her animals work around when I was born, but also a little bit after. So, 40-ish years ago. But she did more than that. And if you trace some of these threads in her work, some important themes arise, I think, regarding her relevance today, which, yes, in moving away from seeing things as the individual versus the collective, right, or domestic versus wild, one or the other, she framed things in a more broad set of overlapping claims, as I mentioned, which include social claims, which would include not just probably humans, but also sentient beings. So that would tend to be not just dogs and cows, but also wolves and, I don't know, like mountain lions and things like this. Or stoats and kiwi, who are currently in conflict, so to speak, in New Zealand, right? And so she spoke of sentient beings as having certain sets of claims on us without necessarily rigidly separating domestic and wild. She also spoke about ecological claims as likewise being these claims by broader collectives of things that you mentioned, right? Non-sentient life, trees, right? They matter, plants, but also, collectives at the like species level, non-sentient animals, various, organic entities, non-organic entities. So, I mean, in a way, kind of between social and ecological, you really have any type of thing you might find in an ecosystem is represented in some form or fashion in her categorization of claims. So it's relevant and helpful, I think, because it gives us a less dichotomous way of seeing the claims that exist in a context, right? Rather than domestic versus wild, there are social and ecological claims that come together in different ways and overlap for different beings. Some of those things have, some of those claims also include things like special responsibility and special need, right? Urgency. So there may be urgent ecological claims that might press us to think about really difficult questions about an ecosystem's fragility, resilience, and things like this in light of, say, introduced quote unquote invasive species. But then again, these species are often, always, often introduced by humans, putting us kind of in this place of special responsibility toward them, an obligation for doing that. Often multiple times over, we've introduced and then reintroduced another species to deal with that species, and so the human involvement puts all of these levels of responsibility on us that tend to be flattened out when it tends to be put in terms of, say, even like native versus invasive, but also domestic versus wild. Our fingerprints are all over this, and the history of colonialism. So when you think about New Zealand, we have that as well. We have kiwis are being predated upon by stoats, which are introduced to take care of another introduced species, which rabbits or something probably, right? And so we have these layers that then get reduced down to, well, stoats are eating our native bird, right? While this history of not just colonialism, but introduction of species, and sentience and ecological needs are all being kind of just like thrown about, and then a decision is made. And so what Midgley does is, I think, draw our attention to all those dynamics more. And kind of the rub, though, is that it also might push us toward not. So she's very pragmatic in the end, which is kind of interesting. So she's like, we have to make decisions. And the problem is they're going to probably not be great decisions a lot of the time, because we're often going to be in these scenarios where we can't make a good decision given the circumstances. We're going to be looking at probably better or worse decisions, lesser of two evils, things that we have set up for ourselves that we have to deal with, but that are not going to be pretty. So she's pragmatic, but also she introduces things that at least should force us to take much more into consideration in guiding our choices than maybe some other models and principles might give us. And as I say, it might not always be very clean and tidy. It might end up being kind of messy. I think Midgley adds a lot of messiness into ethics sometimes simplifies, but also adds a lot of messiness. And I think she would say that's just reality. And that's the way life is. That's the way ethics is. It's not simple. We have a demand for simplicity, but we often don't have a right to demand that on the circumstances. So where does this get us? I mean, I think that is important. It's appealing in a way, and it's also difficult in a way, right? To have a very sophisticated and nuanced awareness of the different claims and how they interact. The risk is, in the face of all of that complexity, that it swings back again into oversimplification, right? Swings back the other way. Well, we just need one principle here that's going to cut through all this complexity. And that's the very thing she started into the equation with and resisting. So it's a challenge. I don't think there's a clean way out of it. But I think it's real, more real in a way. Yeah.
That's a nice setup for it. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, but
I
overlooked the important part of it. And in guiding all that, these like compassion, like for not just these claims, but the beings involved. They're not just like categorized. They're not just sentient beings or ecological. These are real beings and species that matter to us. That's the whole picture, right? All part of this community, these overlapping communities. So you have all the overlapping claims that make it messy. But the reason it's especially messy is because these are real animals, real beings that are important to us. And so those efforts to simplify through all that, again, are discarding not just the complexity of the claims, but the driving compassion and the community that is important to the whole thing. Yeah, sorry, I drove right past that key piece of it. Yeah.
That's good. That's good. So, Fred, I think this is a good setup for that last second question that I think you might have. And maybe we'll give you the last word and then we'll wrap up.
Oh, you can bring it up. You can frame it better than I about the transactional nature.
Well, I wasn't thinking about that so much. I was thinking more about, do we have time for the complexity and the messiness? So let me paraphrase Fred right now.
I forget my own questions, Greg.
One of the questions that Fred raised when we were reading your book was all this contextuality, situated moral understanding, appreciating the messiness, being pluralistic is super, super important to avoid, the ideological, dogmatic simplifications. But we face a world that's in polycrisis. And do we have time to do that? And we were wondering what you would think about such a question.
I mean, I know she would have a lot to say about things. She did have a lot of things to say about things, and there's a lot that didn't go into the interviews that are relevant to current circumstances. Midgley was she's a very kind and generous person, like I said, but she never shied away from a fight, and she was never afraid to say when something is wrong and why, and to really kind of lay into it. And that's because someone like me, I might be a little more timid to do something like that. I tend to lean a little more cautious. I don't know, but it's difficult, as I mentioned earlier. And I think she might have had similar inclinations, but she did it anyway. She went after big, important topics. She went after big political ideas. She went after. She was highly critical of Richard Dawkins and the selfish gene, for example. Really because of the rhetoric and its connection to political rhetoric of the time and how it seemed to kind of overlap with and reinforce the era, as she kind of put it in so many words. And there are some other things there. There are always these things that kind of rise up. That philosophy, I guess, ideally, she would say, is there to meet. And she would talk about how philosophy, a lot of times, philosophers often don't engage with and recognize stuff that is important. It's overlooked. It's seen as maybe noise or background. But even these outrageous, insane things, maybe should be engaged as thought and not just noise because of their impacts, especially as they continue and develop in ways that tend to intensify. So, and Midgley was arrested for protesting a nuclear outside of a nuclear plant 1.2, right? So she's got a criminal record for civil disobedience and this type of thing. So, she was one of those people I think that did stand up and oppose things as she saw important, and that we all should. But I also think one of the things she's given us is the tools to see all the complexity of situations. But again, as you get into more of the complexity of the situation, are we in an environment where people are receptive to working through all the layers and challenges of complexity, right? Like we might with the Predator Free by 2050 campaign in New Zealand. I don't know why that one keeps coming to mind, but it's just a really pithy and easy one to kind of point at. There are those issues, but many more. And I find Midgley very inspirational in the way that she engaged these topics, and that's why she would write editorials and things like this. I think that's important. I think public philosophy has an important role there, because if we do think that how we think influences how we live, and philosophers are important resources for how we think and diagnosing problems in how we think, which might influence how we live. I mean, it does seem to point toward the need for philosophical engagement with the world for public philosophy, which she tended to model. So I do tend to think that there's something there. However tentative someone like myself, however tentative, let me just phrase that, I might be to jump into the fray when I sometimes feel like I should, that I think is a good message, because if we do believe her claims, right, if we do agree with her claims about how we think influencing how we live, that does seem to give good reason for acting in certain ways, It does involve a lot of complexity, but it does involve lots of reasons for action, I think she would say, right? And part of the reason she's such a pluralist is she says there are lots of reasons why things are wrong, right? Not just one, and there are lots of reasons to act. So, yeah. I could probably go on for a while thinking about that, but it's a tough one.
Yeah, you could. One of the things Midgley said to me was that sometimes working through the complexity gives you the better answer. It may take a little more work, but it is clarifying it that way. She was never subject to the paralysis of analysis. She saw her way through. Yeah. Greg, this has been absolutely delightful and wonderful, and I'm so glad you agreed to be a guest with us today. We've learned a tremendous amount, and we hope to have you back, especially around your new book when it comes out. Do we have a publication date for that?
It is tentatively December 10th.
Wow.
2026. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a long process, but it should be coming.
So we'll be in further contact, and we'll have you back when this new book is out, and we'll talk more Midgley. But thank you very much.
That sounds great.
For being with us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you all. Really nice to see you all and meet you all, and appreciate the questions. And thanks, Bill, for having me and all of your expert podcasting.
All right, folks, this is going to be a wrap. PanThinks is a production of PanWorks, an ethics, science, and policy think tank for the well-being of animals. It is edited and produced by Gary Shear with the help of Bill Lynn. To learn more about PanWorks, visit our website at panworks.io. To donate to our work, please visit our support page on our website. Until next time, this is PanWorks, bringing ethics to life.